Ladies and gentlemen, the 9th generation of consoles is well underway, and we finally have a great understanding of what the PlayStation 5 as well as the Xbox Series consoles are capable of, since cross-generation games, let's say with the PS4, are becoming less commonplace. Horizon Burning Shore is a great example of what Sony, for example, can achieve without the previous generation having a noose around its neck. Nevertheless though, rumours of upgraded hardware persist, and rumours of a PS5 Pro in particular over the past week or two have become quite common in the gaming press. In this video then, as you probably guessed from the title, I want to discuss what I've been hearing from my own sources since I was discussing a PS5 Pro's existence well over a year ago, give you some updates to the news in just general, but also what the performance targets of these machines could actually be and what the actual point of them actually being released to the market would be. I'm going to be discussing all of that along with a lot more after this message from the video's sponsor.
If you're running a copy of Windows 10 which isn't activated, of course, not only do you have to worry about the missing customization options, but there's also that annoying Windows desktop watermark reminding you to activate. Today's video is sponsored by WhoKeys.com, and they have an excellent price on Windows 10 Professional as well as Home keys. Yeah, and they also of course sell games. I've bought a few Windows 10 keys with my own personal account to test everything was legit and worked in preparation for this sponsored video. You can pick up one of their keys for 25% off using the coupon code RGT in the checkout. There's links to their website in the video description. Also, if you're building a few systems, there's bundles available too. Again, you can check out WhoKeys.com and use the coupon code RGT for 25% off the listed Windows 10 key prices.
Casting our eyes back to the 8th generation consoles, the original machines launched in November 2013. With the upgraded PS4 hardware, the PS4 Pro of course, coming to the market 3 years later, and Microsoft throwing their hat into the upgraded console ring with the Xbox One X a year after that, bringing us to 2017. There were a few purposes to the souped up gear found inside the machines. 4K screens were becoming commonplace in gamers' homes, and combining that with features like HDR support, improved frame rates, better overall visuals, it just made sense, particularly from a resolution standpoint. Many games at the time were rendering below 1080p for the internal resolution, and upscaling methods, especially on the original machines back in 2013, were not exactly that impressive. Nowadays, gamers expect lots of performance options, higher frame rate modes, substituting graphical effects like ray tracing or resolution for frame rate, or just cranking everything up to the fullest. And as I said in the intro, games now are looking very impressive. The new Horizon DLC Burning Shore and games like Jedi Survivor, despite some technical issues here or there, especially on Jedi Survivor, it looks incredible. But it's not hard to imagine the extra GPU horsepower wouldn't make the games look better, along with of course other system resources. Well over a year ago now, I reported whispers from my own sources. A PlayStation 5 Pro was being developed. I'd been told that the performance targets were roughly 2 times in raster performance and more like 2.5 times in ray tracing. Adding to this, shortly after I put these videos out, there were a couple of very interesting things which happened. Firstly, there was a very intriguing number of patents from Sony discussing ray tracing features such as ray shortening the original machines just were not capable of doing. The base PS5, like AMD's RX 6000 series of graphics cards and Microsoft's Xbox Series consoles, use RDNA 2's ray tracing features. Without going too much into the ground that I covered in those older videos, this older GPU IP just does not have the features that we see in the Sony patent. It looks more closely aligned to RDNA 3, possibly though with some custom work. Again, the patents are a little ambiguous in places, but it certainly does not look like something that the original console hardware is capable of. Now of course, a patent is a patent, doesn't necessarily become a product, but in addition to this there was a presentation from Sony which made its way online. And this was advanced technology for ray tracing again. This time, the focus was clearly movies, at least for this presentation, but it actually specifically mentions gaming as well. I've covered this again in more depth along with the patent in previous PS5 videos, but the very basic gist here is that there are fewer rays needed in a scene, and the ML is then used to paint in missing details. More recently though, several of my sources, including ones who gave me the original PS5 Pro info, told me that the PS5 Pro's APU, along with the actual project, seems to be dead. It's no longer in development, and the project is essentially mothballed. But even more recently still, a journalist, Tom Henderson, over at Insider Gaming, has reported that the PS5 Pro is going to happen. He claims that the release time frame window for the console is somewhere in holiday 2024, coinciding actually with some of my own information about the release window of the console. Now, he also says that the prototype hardware, the development kits, will be basically within the first-party studio hands of Sony in the next several months, next 2-3 months. Now, this actually makes sense. Generally speaking, first-party studios, of course, get to eat first. They get to figure out how the hardware works. They get to essentially provide feedback. So, oh dear, is this screwed? Oh dear, is this a problem? Because obviously, Sony doesn't want to start sending out a whole bunch of development kits. A, that's going to cost them money. B, it's going to be a lot of time. And C, if there are some really big bugs and they need to go back to the drawing board, it's better that they have a small, really close-knit group who really know the hardware, really know the base console, to say, hey, this needs to change, guys, or you know what, this is amazing, let's go for it. I also feel that at this stage, it's important to bring up a report over at Tweaktown, and on that website, it largely cites Insider Gaming's rumour, but also points out a number of development kits that Sony have sent out. You can look at the dates on screen. The spike, though, seems to be indicating, to me anyway, that it was for the PSVR 2. Now, don't forget, development kits go under numerous revisions anyway, so it's possible that development kits are going to continue to be sent out. After all, new studios are even formed, new development kits are going to be needed for those as well. But I don't think these kits are for the PS5 Pro. Tom Henderson doesn't think so, and he apparently knows when the kits are going to be sent out. I frankly agree that at this stage, again, if holiday 2024 is really the target, it just doesn't seem like this would be the kits. But I'd love to be wrong, because obviously that would mean leaks are going to happen faster. Then, I decided to dig back through all of my old sources, ask them again if I could find out anything more about the PS5 Pro. And honestly, I've received what can be best described as a mixed set of responses. I was going to actually release this video last week, but I just kept hearing different things, and I want to get as much information for you all as possible before I release the video. The first group of sources, including one of the original sources who told me about the PS5 Pro's existence, as well as some of the performance targets, believes that the project and the APU itself is dead. Examples of things I was told include the APU I knew about for the PS5 Pro is no longer in development. As far as I know, the project is dead. And finally, the PS5 Pro was definitely in a prototype stage, geez, I can't speak, but probably not entering MP, mass production. The second group, though, they think the project is alive, but what's happened is that the vision has changed a little bit, and so it's now using a different APU. Now, annoyingly, this again includes another original source who gave me the performance targets. Now, I know I sound like I'm making that up for the video, but honestly, it's what I was told, and frankly, it's a little confusing, and again, one of the reasons that I have been holding out, like releasing this video, because I was trying to find out more information. It does make sense when you think that companies are very strict in their security measures, like having their phones monitored, but if the second group is right, and the vision has simply shifted, it would be similar to, for example, Nintendo and the Switch Pro, which has undergone numerous revisions. At this point, it's not even really a Switch Pro, it's an entirely new piece of hardware, probably its own new generation. Previously, when I first heard about the system, it was basically, well, just a Switch Pro. I actually leaked some of the performance targets of it, and the fact it was going to be using NVIDIA's DLSS, which was then confirmed by NVIDIA. Well, should I say, for a leak and a hack from NVIDIA. But now, to my personal understanding, the console has gone under a couple of revisions since then, and it seems that even the CPU performance has undergone significant upgrades. I was told, by the way, and this is a complete aside, that with DLSS, the console was roughly targeting performance similar to the Xbox Series S, but this was some time ago, so honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if that's just totally inaccurate now. Frankly, though, The first group now thinks that all hands are on deck for the next generation PlayStation, the PS6, as well as the next generation Xbox. This information is just conflicting. Tom Henderson thinks that he's accurate in reports, and honestly, I just don't know how to call this. I'm going to proceed though with the video that it's true, because obviously we want to talk about the potential if it is. As another slight aside, I've also been told and made a video on of an Xbox Series mid-generation refresh, and the APU inside of that was Saban. Again, I've spoken about this console quite at length, so I don't want to tread over old ground too much here. I'll try to remember to link it in the video description. If I forget, you can search Red Gaming Tech Sabin, S-A-B-I-N. It was based on RDNA 3 and Zen 4, and was basically a halfway house in performance between the Xbox Series S and X, at least in terms of raw GPU performance and memory. But it was released at the same price as the Xbox Series S's MSRP, but used a cool ML block to upsample games to a higher resolution, but it was scrapped by Microsoft. Because if it's confusing to you, and I'm sure you've probably got more technical knowledge than most people as I'm explaining this, imagine how confusing it would be for the general market. It would also mean that developers themselves would need to optimize as well as support free SKUs. It's not like, oh, look, the Xbox Saban is released, we can just drop the Series S. That's just, that just can't happen. So, again, it felt like it was confusing the market and just failed its business case. With that said, the gaming industry can be very reactionary. It's possible that Microsoft are working on a mid-generation high-end console, much more powerful, let's say 2 times the Series X. And in fact, someone's already told me they are, but this was quite some time ago. And I personally think, though, that Xbox at this stage are all hands on deck for the next generation Xbox. But it's going to be very interesting to see what their strategy is. Focusing on the PS5 Pro though, well, a codename I've heard regarding the console is Viola, but it does not seem to be the codename for either the PS5 Pro's project or the APU. Instead, it seems to be some type of PCIe controller, probably the SSD. I want to stress that this could be wrong, as I've been given internal documents from a non-Sony engineering team. I cannot publish them because I would get murdered. But it's possible that it was not from a Sony console because, well, let's just say some of the code names were blanked. But I was told by a couple of other sources that the name Viola was actually in association with a PS5 Pro. So it's either misinformation or someone getting their wires crossed or the PS5 Pro's SSD controller. I also want to say, and this is I'm pretty confident in, if the PS5 Pro does exist or gets released, we do not need a multiple of 36 compute units. You may recall that the PS4 Pro basically has a quote-unquote butterfly design, doubling the number of compute units from the original machine to 36. Coincidentally, the PS5 base model runs with 36 compute units. Actually, technically speaking, there's 40 on the APU, there's 4 disabled for yields. So you can basically say, well, of course, double that using complicated maths is 72. In theory, though, to my understanding from what I'm told by multiple people, Sony could go with a completely different number. They could go with 40, they could go with 44, they could go with 50, whatever. And this is because there are a number of advancements Sony have made. We already saw some older ones like fine-grained clocks and other tech, which is probably, like, for example, more similar to what they did with the PS4. But, basically, to my understanding, when you put a game into the PS5 Pro, it would essentially do the following. If you put a game in which is patched or designed from the start to run on the PS5 Pro, the game would essentially boot with all compute units and full clock speed enabled. If the game doesn't have a Pro mode, it would boot, and then some of the CU, some of the GPU would be disabled, and the clock speed of the GPU and other stuff would be reduced. So that's kind of similar to PS4 Pro, but I think a little differently because, again, it can be much more selective on how it disables or enables parts of the chip. Sony have a number of patents. These are likely filed before the PS5 Pro was in development, but we get some idea of some of the functionality. Running a legacy application on a non-legacy device with application-specific operating parameters for backwards compatibility is one of the patent names, or the comparatively sprightly backwards compatibility by restriction of hardware resources. Now, Sony have almost certainly filed a number of Pro patents, again if the machine actually exists and gets released, that we will not see for months, probably years. But again, I don't think doubling the CU is what the specification is. I don't think it's 72. Not only because, well, the design of the PS5 in terms of like clock frequency and stuff like that, but the sheer size of the GPU portion would need to be gigantic, even on 5 and M. Now, I'm going to assume that you guys are not super familiar with AMD's RDNA 3 lineup for desktop, which is based on, of course, N31, N32, and N33. But the GCD, which is basically just the graphic stuff, I'll get more into the specifics on N31 and stuff in a moment, it sports 96 compute units, and the die is 308 square millimeters. N32 is probably more realistic. It's 60 compute units and just about 200. Now, there's some space saving AMD could do with a monolithic APU, because N31 and N32 are both chiplet. But ideally, a PS5 Pro APU would be 400 at max. More realistically, it would be considerably less than that, around 350-ish. To put some other numbers at you, the PS4 Pro APU was about 330, 360 for the Xbox One and Xbox Series X, and the PS5 base model was 308. I want to guess, and this is not a leak, based upon what I've been told, 30 workgroup processors or 60 compute units is probably more realistic, give or take a few. Now, I think that the chip will probably clock for the GPU very high, and we'll get more into why later on, but I think it's very possible we could see mid to high 2 GHz, especially with what AMD are doing with RDNA 3 Plus's Strix Point. There are some differences with RDNA 3 Plus, or 3.5 if you prefer. It actually does include some elements of RDNA 4. Actually, it's got one, I think, which is basically floating point SALU performance support, but I don't know if PS5 Pro's APU would be RDNA 3 Plus or not. I honestly don't know, but I can say that it's probably going to clock pretty high. T-flops, though, because that's inevitably the question, how many T-flops are we looking at? You can't just take the number 60 and then just, for example, multiply it in the same way as you can with, let's say, RDNA 2, because just for your FYI, if you want to do that with the PS5, you take 36 multiplied by 64, and then you essentially multiply that by the clock frequency, and then you multiply that by 2. But with RDNA 3, it's a little different, because the actual GPU architecture has changed quite a lot across multiple areas. We have major differences in geometry. The whole geometry system has changed quite a lot. Ray tracing, but also the compute units. You can see on screen this diagram. You can see the left block with the scheduler and, of course, the general purpose register. It states floating point, integer, and matrix SIMD32. But then there's a second block to the right, and the astute amongst you will probably see that it says float a matrix SIMD32. This new block is essentially one of the new changes of RDNA 3. Again, there's a number of them. And for FP32 performance, it basically doubles the floating point performance because you've got this extra SIMD block. Now, I'm going to make an assumption here that Sony would have a similar CU layout. But if they did, you just can't compare FP32 results directly from, let's say, the PS5 to PS5 Pro, because even if they had the same number of compute units, the PS5 Pro would have considerably more T-flops because it's got all of those additional SIMDs. But that doesn't necessarily mean you can double the frame rate, because T-flops don't mean everything. For a start, games don't necessarily leverage these units, and there's also a lot of other bottlenecks across the system. I want to stress that I am very much skipping over a ton of technical information. I am simplifying this and giving you a bullet points. And there are several things that I've really skimmed over to the point where I'm not giving you enough information to really empower you. I would highly suggest you check out, if you're interested in RDNA 3 more exhaustively, a couple of the articles I've plonked in the video description, or you can check out my PC analysis. Again, I'm trying to make this video somewhat succinct because it's already getting really long. But you can see on screen a comparison of the RDNA 2 based 6950 XT from AMD and the RX 7900 XT, again from AMD, based on RDNA 3's architecture. You can see that the T-flops have just ballooned. There are a number of other changes with this new tech, as I said, improved ray tracing, geometry and more, but this is just how tech advances. There's also other questions like the instructions between RDNA 2 and 3. I have no idea at the moment how Sony would be able to deal with this, because there's quite a lot of difference. Maybe some of the older GFX IP is in the design. Maybe they've come up with some type of internal solution. I honestly don't know. But this is also a great time to bring up the infamous TCL leak. Now, I'm personally skeptical that any TV brand would have complete knowledge of Sony's plans, but you can see on screen a presentation where they show Gen 9.5, and they state that the PS5 Pro would roughly be on par with the RX 7700 XT from AMD. This is a slightly cut down N32. Now, again, this is an unreleased graphics card, and names across this entire stack, as of the time I'm recording this, could change, but generally is expected to feature 54 compute units, and the 7800 XT would be 60 compute units. There's also the question what Sony would do with the PS5 design in terms of infinity cache and memory configuration. In RDNA 2, the consoles do not include infinity cache, with the desktop and mobile variants actually incorporating it because they have bandwidth deficits. AMD basically use slower GDDR6 memory, whereas Microsoft and Sony decided to go with faster memory, and the reason they did this is to essentially save APU size, die size. They decided faster memory was the better option. In the desktop RX 6700 XT, which is very close to a PS5 GPU, at least in terms of the number of compute units and a few other aspects, you can see the infinity cache is 96 megabytes, and this is a monolithic die, meaning it's a single chip basically. The desktop N31 is chiplet, and it moves the infinity cache from the GPU itself, known now as the GCD, to separate chips known as MCDs. These have basically two purposes. The first is a memory controller, and the second is infinity cache. Each MCD has 16 megabytes of infinity cache. So, in the total of N31's highest end SKUs, there are 6 of these, so you do 16 times 6 equals 96 megabytes of infinity cache. But what? How does that work? The 7900 XTX is massively faster than the 6700 XT, but they have the same amount of infinity cache. That just doesn't make sense. Well, of course it does make sense, because AMD's engineers are smart. So RDNA 3 itself is much better in how it deals with the cache. It has larger caches, not the infinity caches I mean the rest of the chip. It's much more bandwidth efficient, plus also the memory chips themselves, the GDDR chips, are much faster. So Sony have several options. They could leverage an infinity cache on a monolithic die, similar to RDNA 2, or they could throw MCDs into the mix, like as I mentioned a moment ago, or perhaps they would go with just faster GDDR6 modules. This is probably more realistic, if I'm honest. The PS5's memory was 14 Gbps, and memory now is available at speeds well in the north of 20. Again, Sony could also go with a 256-bit bus and have much more memory bandwidth, or they could go with a wider bus, let's say 320-bit, and not only would they get more memory bandwidth, but they would also be able to plonk on additional chips as well, which means more memory. You can see a couple of example configurations on screen yourself of what Sony could do. For the CPU, my guess is that Sony will keep 8 cores, 16 threads, the same as the original console. Multi-threaded workloads are, well, hard to optimize for at the best of times. So, instead of thinking, well, 16 cores, there you go, it just would make more sense to have a fewer number of CPU cores which are much more efficient and much faster. Also, CPU cores eat up a lot of space. I'd actually heard initially the PS5 Pro would actually leverage Zen 4, but one of my sources has actually told me that there's evidence of Viola, that SSD chip, will seem to be working alongside Zen 5, but honestly, I've had a couple of sources tell me different things about Viola, so I would again take that with a huge truckload of salt, guys. I think Zen 4 is more likely. Zen 4 launched on PC last year. Zen 5 is out on the desktop 2024. Now, development timelines for console APUs are really long, so again, I think Zen 4 is more likely. But to add some more variables to the mix, we could also potentially see not Zen 4 or Zen 5, but instead Zen 4C or Zen 5C. Now, Zen 5C and Zen 4C are very similar to their non-C counterparts. The difference is, and again, I'm somewhat simplifying here, they're denser in design and reduce L3 cache, and typically operate at lower clock frequencies and tighter power envelopes. A modded version of these cores would easily provide a massive increase over Zen 2, even with only a modest in clock speed increase. Because Zen 2, well, you can see yourself the difference in IPC between Zen 4 and Zen 2. And Zen 5, by the way, I've heard is actually really big over Zen 4. I've had different figures, but well over 20%, essentially. So, even if the L3 cache was shaved down to be, let's say, the same 8 megabytes as the PS5's Zen 2 chip, Zen 4 also has much more L2 cache anyway, double that of Zen 2. It's got 1 megabyte versus 512 kilobytes. So I think that AMD and Sony have a lot of options for CPUs. I would also guess that Sony would heavily ask AMD customize the cores, cutting heavy AVX functionality. Sony did this for the original PS5, shaving down AVX for Zen 2's CPUs. It saved an absolutely modest area of space on the die, but basically Sony had the developers instead push these tasks associated with AVX to GPU compute, as it's more energy efficient and more performant in a console context. Ultimately, what I want you guys to do when looking at the PS5 in terms of what is Sony going to do is remember the console's strategy with the PS5. They opted for a narrower, faster console architecture to push data through the system as quickly as possible. GPU clocks were designed to be as fast as possible, and caches would be flushed and refreshed, and basically all of this stuff was designed to empower developers but not stress them, so they didn't have to worry about a lot of manual stuff and getting the most out of the system. A wider design for the PS5 would almost always take a backseat to higher GPU clocks. If Sony had a decision of more CU but lower speed, or a narrower, faster design, it would always want to choose the latter. Because it's easier, and this is a general statement, to say that narrower designs, they do have some trade-offs such as fewer RT cores, but it's easier to maximize the throughput of the console. A GPU, which runs at, let's say, 2.6 to 2.8 gigahertz, roughly 60 compute units with an 8 CPU core, I think this is quite realistic. Now, but again, this is based upon very little information, and nothing is official until it is literally a console which Sony have announced, and ideally even on store shelves. Sony's goal for the PS5 Pro would be to encourage developers to use the features with as little effort as possible. I was told that it would be relatively easy for them to turn up the dials, more ray tracing bounces, increased resolution, frame rates, but if a developer wanted to go in and maximize everything in a system, they could do that. It would allow developers to really improve their vision of a game. For what it's worth, I've been told that high refresh rate, ray tracing, multi-bounce with the focus, increased resolution of course at high frame rates, but also a premium VR experience. But again, this information was based upon the older design, so who knows what's changed since then. Generally speaking, my thoughts for the PlayStation 5 Pro would be pretty positive if Sony were to release the hardware. There have been a lot of games now Sony have been releasing on the PC, and you can make a very good argument that a great reason for the PS5 Pro to be released would be for it to graphically be able to keep up with high-end PC hardware. Of course, at the end of the day, most folks are not willing to drop, let's say, $1,000 on a high-end PC GPU, but it would be very interesting to see what a souped-up console could actually achieve from Sony. There's also a very good possibility, though, that both vendors will decide just to hold fire, wait for the next generation. From a geek perspective, for someone who just loves consoles and talking about hardware and playing video games, I would love Sony to release a PS5 Pro because I just think it would be really cool to mess around with. Let me know, though, down below what your thoughts are regarding the machine. As a small aside, I've heard that the console would be very expensive. We're talking like $699 to possibly even more, and obviously that's not a small amount of money. But you can also make a very good argument that that machine would last you 2-3 years, whatever, until the next generation, as being like the creme de la creme that Sony offer. And given the number of folks who are happily plonking down hundreds, if not thousands of US dollars on new iPhones, iPads, whatever, of course there is that argument as well. Again, I want to hear your thoughts on this. Would you be willing for Sony to release a PS5 Pro, and would you buy it? What would be your maximum price point? Would you do so if you already have a PS5 machine? What would be the defining factors? What would be the feature set that would actually make you part with your money? Would it just be higher resolution, better ray tracing performance, for example? Or would there need to be something else, a new feature, that would really help to sell you the machine? I'm going to be very interested to see how this generation unfolds, because I don't think even, let's say, the PlayStation 6 is going to be the end of physical hardware for any length of time. I think that Microsoft, for example, will continue to push its xCloud, Sony will do the same for its streaming services, and of course there are no shortage of streaming services, including from Nvidia. It's going to be a very curious evolution of console hardware, and I'm very excited to see what we can actually get out of these consoles. I suspect, for example, the PlayStation 6 is just going to be absolutely monstrous in performance compared to the PS5. I think that ray tracing performance for these next generation consoles, the PS6, is going to be absolutely phenomenal. I wouldn't act phenomenal, Jesus, I can't speak suddenly. And I wouldn't be surprised actually if we start to see some titles even become path traced, which of course is a step beyond. With that said though, thanks very much for watching the video. I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.